Welcome to Just Stripper Things. As you're watching this video, please remember that we can all do our part in amplifying the voices of marginalized people, of drawing attention to their stories, stripping the stigma. It's the least we can do as allies. So do the work. Put effort into it, because ally is a verb, not a noun. The history of sex work in Vancouver, Canada is much older than what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be focusing on the end of the golden age of prostitution in Vancouver, the ways in which the laws enacted have only served to further stigmatize and endanger the most vulnerable, and how the laws concerning sex work enabled a serial killer to prey upon street-based sex workers, especially Indigenous women, for 20 years. Canada didn't create most of its own laws regarding prostitution, not until rather recently, since we inherited most of our laws from the UK. Those laws were consolidated in the Criminal Code in 1892. The laws mainly dealt with pimping, procuring, operating brothels, and soliciting. Most amendments to date have dealt with the latter, originally classified as a vagrancy offense. This was amended to soliciting in 1972 and communicating in 1985. Our history lesson will start with the Penthouse, which some of you may know is one of Vancouver's strip club institutions. The Penthouse used to be a supper club, a place where one could see a show, have a drink, and meet a companion for the night. It was a place where sex workers could meet and, more importantly, screen potential clients in an indoor setting. In 1975, undercover police raided the Penthouse, and the Filipponi family were charged with keeping a bawdy house. They appealed, and their convictions were overturned. Though the Penthouse reopened in 1979, it was never the same. You could still have a drink and watch beautiful women get naked on stage, since it's still a strip club. But the raids and shutdowns drove the sex work trade onto the streets. The Penthouse was shut down in 1975, which was the same year that the first recorded murder of a sex worker occurred in Vancouver. The statistics for murdered and missing sex workers, especially Indigenous sex workers, would rise drastically as conditions were made dangerous by the very institutions that should have protected them. Many of the sex workers displaced by raids on their indoor workplaces, like the Penthouse in the Zanzibar, moved to strolls in the West End, where they established a thriving community. There, they built stable friendships, clientele, community connections, and economic capacity as independent, pimp-free contractors. Co-workers often shared apartments, worked in pairs, recorded license plate numbers of clients, and protected each other. Jamie Lee Hamilton, who worked in the strolls and lived in the West End at the time, says, "We were a pimp-free zone. If a pimp came down, we told him to put on some lipstick and suck cock like the rest of us." It was a heterogeneous, racially diverse community of sex workers, some of whom were queer themselves. A 2001 survey recruited participants from all of Vancouver's street prostitution strolls at the time. 31% of their subjects were Aboriginal. Another survey of Vancouver street-level sex workers, recruited mainly from the downtown east side, reported that 51% of the sample was Aboriginal. The social and economic marginalization of Aboriginal women reflects the multi-generational legacy of colonial oppression in the form of concerted attempts to destroy West Coast Aboriginal culture in the late 19th and much of the 20th century through a variety of coercive mechanisms, including the residential school system. A 1995 study sample of 85 sex workers provides one of the most detailed descriptions of the characteristics and experiences of street-involved women in the downtown East Side. They interviewed 85 women involved in downtown East Side street-based sex trade about a year after the Vancouver Police Department had identified 480 street-involved women in the area. As they interviewed roughly 20% of the population VPD identified, and 70% of the respondents were Aboriginal, this sample is probably relatively representative of the Aboriginal women involved in the street-level trade in the downtown East Side. While these studies were conducted after this time period, the statistics showed that First Nations women are consistently a large part of the street-based sex industry. They were great people, says Jim Deva, owner of Little Sisters Bookshop on Davie. They were people. He says he got to know many of the sex workers during those days. His store was a bit of a haven for them. There were businesses they could go in and socialize. They were really integrated into our community, and it was much safer for them. The community was mostly comprised of women, including Black, transgender, and First Nations women. The Trans Women's Stroll on Davie was the first trans women's stroll in Vancouver. The West End had become the heart of gay Vancouver, with gay-owned and gay-friendly businesses, cruising grounds, and a vibrant street culture. It wasn't long until the lively community came under fire. In 1975, the Gay Police Liaison Committee was formed to mediate disputes between the gay community and the VPD. The committee's decision was that cruising and public sex had to be toned down. This put the cis gay white men at odds with the sex worker community. Ironically, this also put them at odds with members of their own community, the gay male hustlers, who also had their own strolls in the area. In 1980, a group of white, middle-class West End residents organized and formed a group called Concerned Residents of the West End, CROW. Headed by a charismatic and politically savvy white gay man, Gordon Price, CROW successfully lobbied politicians, while their vigilante posse, Shame the Johns, patrolled the streets, and at times went as far as to protest in front of clients' homes. Shame the Johns is not an unfamiliar concept, as even in the present we see this approach of targeting clients who purchase sex. Most notably with the idea of ending demand by enacting legislation in the style of the Nordic model, which criminalizes the purchase of sex. But as it does now, it did back then, only served to put sex workers in danger. The predominantly white male residence groups put targets on an already vulnerable group of people, and their sexist and racist harassment was even worse for non-white and trans sex workers. In 1981, sex workers formed the Alliance for the Safety of Prostitutes, ASP, in an effort to fight back against the nightly incursions from police and Shame the Johns. Unfortunately, their numbers were smaller, and they didn't have the backing of local politicians like CROW did. In 1981, CROW led a one-day conference on prostitution. They invited politicians, a psychiatrist, police inspectors, and social planners. But CROW organizers said they would only consider serious requests from sex workers. At this forum and several others, ASP leaders were not only silenced, but subjected to verbal abuse and harassment. CROW and other abolitionists were also heavily assisted by the media, who fueled the fire with headlines like "Prostitution swells in the West End," "Hookers, lazy crooks or victims," and "Can new bylaw hook the hookers?" In 1984, an editor for the Vancouver Sun went so far as to write what was basically a call to arms for Shame the Johns, claiming back then, and to this day, that that was all for protecting our children.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
It wasn't a civil rights issue then, a matter of race, color, creed, or socioeconomic class. He said in a follow-up article in 2014, quoting the ancient white proverb, "It's not about race." With so much systemic power in their favor, CROW won their battle against an unarmed and systemically marginalized group. What a victory. Vancouver City Council passed the Street Activities Bylaw, dubbed the Anti-Hooker Bylaw by the press, and began enforcement in April 1982. Fines ranged from $350 up to $2,000. And in 6 months, the city had made an estimated $28,000 off it. In short, Mayor Harcourt and Vancouver itself were living off the avails of prostitution. In 1983, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that these types of bylaws were invalid. The ball was already rolling, though, and British Columbia's Supreme Court Chief Justice Alan McEachern ruled to ban blatant, aggressive, disorderly prostitutes from the West End in 1984. We couldn't work there any longer. We couldn't even live there, Jamie Lee Hamilton says. In the late 1970s, Hamilton was arrested for soliciting clients outside a West End liquor store. She recalled, "I was charged and put in jail. It was Halloween, and I remember the police were throwing firecrackers at me as they booked me. They made me strip in front of them. They strip searched me, and they threw me in the male section of the jail." Humiliated and violated, once released, Hamilton was given an area restriction which forced her to move out of the West End. Stacy, a former sex worker, says, "When they moved us, they broke us. They totally disenfranchised all of us." Gordon Price says, "The streets are for everyone, and no one group is going to control them." I have a feeling that he doesn't see the irony in his own statement here. In 1985, soliciting was amended to communicating, and the amendment to the Criminal Code prohibited all communicating in a public place for the purpose of prostitution, including the interior of a motor vehicle. This is how sex workers were stripped of their ability to screen clients, and due to selective enforcement, were pushed into industrial areas and the downtown east side. In 1983, Robert Pickton began his 20 years of terror, preying on the women of the downtown east side, killing 49. In 1986, Gordon Price became the first openly gay member of the Vancouver City Council. How nice for him. The West End was gentrified, and Vancouver was ready to host World Expo 86. So I ask you, what price do we pay for this whitewashed concept of community? Was the death toll worth the peace and quiet? Did the property values make up for the value of human lives? Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you all again in the next part of our Sex Work History in Vancouver series, where in part 2, we will talk about the displacement of sex workers to the downtown east side and the Pickton murders.